things that have occurred, many troubling things that have occurred in our society over the recent months, not the least of which is attitudes towards LGBTQ people, and most recently, trans people. As you know, President Trump introduced an executive order a short time ago banning the recruitment and service of trans people in the United States military. It's estimated that somewhere between 2,500 and 7,000 trans people currently serve in the military. And so while this has not yet been implemented, in fact, the Secretary of Defense is studying it. One light in this darkness was just earlier this week, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford, a 4-star Marine Corps general, was asked to speak on the subject before the Senate Armed Services Committee. And General Dunford had this to say. He said that transgender troops served with honor, and he added this: "I believe any individual who meets the physical and mental standards and is worldwide deployable and is currently serving should be afforded the opportunity to continue to serve." And that's from a Marine Corps general who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Obviously, he's not in agreement with his president, but he stood up and he stated his views. But anyway, for tonight's program, I'm going to ask Associate Director of the Center, Ellen Hernandez, to introduce tonight's speakers. Ellen.
Thank you all so much for being here tonight. I want to introduce to you, we have 3 presenters tonight who are coming to us from their work in Philadelphia, and we're happy to have them here. We have Jacqui Bowman, who is the director of the Center for Education at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, where she develops multidisciplinary educational programming for both healthcare professionals and the public. This work draws upon the world-renowned resources of the Mutter Museum and Historical Medical Library to inspire learning. Particular areas of focus are increasing the diversity of the healthcare and STEM workforce, medicine and the arts, and teen health in an urban environment. In addition to her work as an educator, Bowman is also an anthropologist. She has a PhD in biological anthropology from the University of Cambridge in England, and has worked on numerous collections of human and primate skeletons, both in England and the USA. She's a member of the advisory board to the Gender and Sexuality Development Clinic at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Quincy Greene, her colleague, is currently the Youth Support Coordinator at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia in the Center for Education. He manages 2 STEM pipeline internship programs. The Out for STEM internship, which began in January 2014, is for LGBTQIA youth interested in STEM careers. The TEVA, is that correct? Internship began in 2009, and it serves high school students interested in STEM careers who have experienced community violence. The Out for STEM program has hosted an annual symposium on gender and sexual development with the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia's Gender and Sexuality Development Clinic. The next symposium will be March 6th, 2018, from 5:30 to 7 at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. And if you are interested in that, we'll be providing information to you about that as we can send it to you by email. And finally, we are pleased to also include Tosef Miller, who is a student at Camden County College, hooray, pursuing degrees in deaf studies and biology. He works in the education department at the College of Physicians. There, he writes specialized tours such as Bones Are Not Binary, the American Sign Language Tour, and the Touch Tour for the Blind. We welcome each of them tonight to explain the biological processes behind sex assignment and the biological and environmental complexities of sex determination. Before we begin, I invite you to take the time to silence your cell phones. I also want to refer you to the terminology sheet that's in gold that you were given that you received as you arrived. I think that will be helpful as we proceed. And so without further ado, I present, who's going first? Quincy Greene.
Good evening, everyone. First, I want to say thank you for inviting us to be here and giving us the opportunity to talk about this very important subject. My name is Quincy Greene. I'm the Youth Support Coordinator at the Center for Education at the College of Physicians. My colleagues, Jacqui and Tosif, and I are going to discuss the biology of sex determination, a topic that appears to be simple on the surface, but is actually extremely complex, complicated, and still an area of intense research. So let's take a dive into this topic. The genderbread person is a wonderful way to start an important conversation about anatomical sex. This is our focus today. This series has additional speakers and experts who will cover topics around gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation, but tonight we're going to be focusing on biology of sex. Here's an overview of today's talk. We're going to look at non-human sexual variation, forensics of sex, basic definitions of sex, timeline of human biological sex systems, and then at the end we would ask you to hold your questions so we can have ample time for question and answer. All right, so here's a PA driver's license. How many of you here have a driver's license? Right? So have you looked at what letters are there for sex? So on licenses, there may be an M, an F, or a U. This is a major advance for gender nonconforming and trans folks around the country and around the world. The U means unspecified, which gives folks the freedom to not be defined in binary terms. So in countries like Canada, Germany, India, and Pakistan, all offer gender markers of U or X, or other terms for transgender or non-binary, or people with non-Western genders. In India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, some of these countries use terms like hijra, which means journey in Arabic. Turn it over to Jacqui.
So I'm now going to give you a very, very speedy introduction to the very, very complex world of sex determination in non-humans. We felt like it was important to set the subject in context. So as you can see here, let me see if I can make this work. You can see we have the different types of animals at the top: mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish. And we're going to talk about mammals, but birds have a similar system to mammals. They all have a very similar system. But the reptiles, amphibians, and fish, it's an incredibly complicated system. And rather than try and even approach a sort of overall description of everything that happens, I'm just going to describe actually three different animals and talk to you about how their sex is determined, just to kind of give you a sense of how complicated it is. How do I make this go forward? How do I make it go forward? What am I doing wrong, Quincy? Or is it the wrong thing? Is it this one? Wrong thing. Okay, so you've all seen Finding Nemo, right? Marvin the dad, Nemo the fish, the baby fish who gets lost and found. So in reality, coral fish are really, really interesting examples of sequential hermaphroditism. And what would have really happened had the story in Nemo, really happened on the coral reef, is that once Coral, the mum, died or was eaten by the barracuda, Marvin, the dad, would have slowly started to change in his behavior. He would have become more assertive, he would have become more aggressive, and so there would have been signals from his brain to his gonads that would have slowly meant that he turned into a female, and he would become the dominant female, and he would then have chosen a mate from the other fish that lower down the kind of dominance hierarchy. So that's what would have really happened in that story. So that's an example of sequential hermaphroditism. He would have turned from being male to being female. That's one example of how fish can change sex. Another example that you see in many, many reptiles is environmental sex determination. And this is just an excuse for an extremely cute little tortoise. But really what we're talking about is the fact that with many, many reptiles, what happens is the temperature of the clutch of eggs as it's laid will determine the sex of the offspring in those eggs. So you can see here, you've got your red-eared slider here, and this axis here is the sex ratio. So basically, that's 100% means they're all male. And down here, this is 25% male. And then this is the temperature across the bottom. It's in European figures, but you probably know how to convert that. This is about 80 degrees around here. So what happens is, if they lay their eggs at this temperature here, which is about 27, I think, all of the turtles will be male when they hatch. And it's due to the action of the proteins that are impacted by the heat or not of the environment that will then determine the development, how much of the testosterone is converted to estrogen, and whether the eggs develop into male or female offspring. There are various different types. There's the all or nothing of that, and then there are other types where if the temperature is low, they will all be female. And if the temperature is middling, they'll be male, and the temperature is high, they'll all go back to being female. It's hotly debated what this actually does, what kind of adaptive advantage this gives you. There are various different theories, but interestingly, it's also probably, or one of the theories as to why the dinosaurs died out, in the idea that there was a sudden change in temperature, environmental temperature, which then meant that all the offspring were the same sex, which explains why they died out. So that's an interesting explanation. Of course, there's huge relevance to today in terms of global warming. Is this going to really mess with a lot of reptilian reproduction? There's also another factor that's of concern with regard to this, which is the environmental pollution. Particularly PCBs often have a sort of estrogen effect on the eggs, so they may disproportionately produce female offspring. But that's a subject for another talk. This last one I wanted to show you, I find this very satisfying. This is, they're called the morning squid, which in itself is a fantastic name. This is a female. This is a male. There's another male over here looking this way. So this male squid has actually changed this half of his body to female coloration. So according to the guy over here, he's looking over and thinking, oh, it's just two females, 1, 2. But in fact, it's a male slowly moving in to this female here who he's going to mate with. This is a really interesting example of biological mimicry. Apparently, they only do this about 30% of the time, because apparently if they think they're going to get caught, if there's sort of, maybe 3 males, one here, and one here, who will actually see what he's up to, then they don't do it. But if they think they can get away with it, they do it. And it's fascinating, because literally it's half and half. So you may be thinking, this is all very well, but what's that got to do with the Mutter Museum? I know you were thinking that. So this is the wall of Hertel skulls at the Mutter Museum. This is a fantastic collection that was amassed by Joseph Hertel, that was bought by the museum shortly after it began. It shows the extraordinary range of human skulls. Each of these is a human from all different parts of the world, although a lot of them are European. But it shows you that they all look so different. The collection was purchased in 1874 by the fellows of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, who had been given a bequest by Thomas Dent Mutter to actually start a museum as part of their organization. That became the Mutter Museum. How many of you actually have been to the Mutter Museum? Oh, so many of you. That's great. I know you have. We have one of our ardent supporters and fellows over in the back there, Dave Keatre's. So we're glad to see him tonight. He can probably tell you more about these skulls than I can. Anyway, this is just to give you an example of one of the extraordinary exhibits that we have on display there. We've used the draw of this museum. I mean, it's really, really a place that particularly young people want to be. It's so cool. They want to be there. So we've used it as a way to really draw in young people from Philadelphia and really try and encourage them to follow STEM careers, particularly careers in healthcare. So we've had multiple programs come through. And when it comes to our students and the public, one of the most popular exhibits in the museum is actually the Reading the Dead exhibit, which is about forensic science. It's about how do you identify an individual through a forensic investigation. If you find a body, particularly a skeletal body, how do you identify that individual? This has been incredibly popular. Everybody wants to know about it, and I think a lot of it's to do with the television shows that people watch. Everybody loves those. But it's enabled us to actually develop some curriculum that Tosef actually has worked on with us, called Bones Are Not Binary, which is really a way to introduce the whole idea of breaking down the binary expectation of sex with young people, even as young as middle schoolers. We've used the idea of forensic science and bones and skulls to introduce this topic to them, because sometimes it's a really hard topic to talk about. So that's what we've been developing recently, and we're going to actually try it out a little bit on you guys. As I say, we're talking about the fact that you can actually identify the sex, or you can estimate the sex of an individual who's found, maybe who's been burned or been buried for a long time. One of the ways that you identify who that person is and find the family of this deceased individual is to look at the bones. And one of the first questions people ask is, what sex is this person? It's one of the criteria. You want to know what age they are, what sex they are, how tall they are, etc., etc. I'm just going to talk about the skull now. In the past, there's been this, when everyone was thinking in terms of a binary, they would say, right, these are male characteristics on a skull, these are female characteristics on a skull. But what we're really thinking about now in terms of is the influence of testosterone on skeletal development, particularly skull development, and how it impacts both the bone development, also impacts the muscle strength and development, and how that can influence the shape of a skull. So here you can see at the top we have a skull influenced by testosterone. It looks more robust. It has, if you look at how the jaw is here compared to here, it's got more of a brow ridge area here. The chin is squarer than this chin here. And one of the ways that people have used over a number of years, when they find a skeleton, they'll say, okay, well, let's look at a number of characteristics of this skull, and this will help us decide, who this person might be. So in doing this, the forensic scientists look at a number of different characteristics, and they're shown up here, and I think you may have got this as a handout. But interestingly, they always show these characteristics in a range of 5 different ones. So on the left, it would be the most, in inverted commas, female, and on the right, the most male. So if you look at the skulls are being sent around. You can see here is the nuchal area, which is at the back of the skull, which is where the neck muscles insert. It can be very, very rugged, or it can be smooth. You've got the mastoid process, which is here, which is this area here. The ear, the hole there is the ear going into the auditory canal. You've got the supraorbital margin, which is here, which represents this. If you feel, as the skulls are coming around, feel that above the eyebrow, how sharp it is or how rounded it is. And then down here, we have the brow ridge, the kind of, the classic sort of Neanderthal look of like really wrinkled, like furrowed brows, very highly developed supraorbital region. That's often connected with, dramatically strong musculature, all of these are impacted by the muscles of the skull. These are the neck muscles go to here. These are the, here, come down to the clavicle. Then you've got this area here, supraorbital, and then the chin, obviously, and the side of the mandible are much more rugged when there's more testosterone in the individual. So this is how, when you find your body, you look at this and you say, okay, which of these criteria does my body have? And that must tell us, you know, what sex the individual is. So we're going to take some of our Hertel skulls, and we're going to have you look at those and see what you think. These are two. We picked 5, and we tried to range them from less to more in terms of the influence of testosterone. So we have these 2. This one died because he cut off his own testicles. Not pleasant. And then these 2 here. And just to ask you how you might, if you found these 5 bodies, would you consider what group of, would you like to sex them? Anyone like to sex these 2? Oh, male and female? Okay, yeah. Okay. And then this one? That's interesting, you should say that. So, both male, the one on the left is male, the one on the far right is female. So, I didn't show you that just to say, wait, this doesn't work. And I didn't show you that to make you think, oh, crikey, if they find a body, they're never going to be able to tell you who it is. Because actually, when they find a body, there are other areas of the body that they look at that have more weight in terms of determining the sex of the individual. So you would look at the pelvis primarily. That would be the first thing and the most important thing you would look at. I just really showed you this as a way to try and get you away from this kind of binary expectation that we've got males and we've got females. And this is how we do it with middle school kids. We start with this, and we then take the conversation from there. But it's a lovely way to draw kids into the discussion without it becoming sort of awkward and weird at the beginning. So I just wanted to give you an insight to how we do that. And now I'm going to hand over to Tosef.
How do I make the clicker work?
Took the pointer. I think it's that one there. That's the pointer, and that's the forward.
Here we have the gender-read person again that Quincy talked about in the beginning. And so someone's gender identity is how they feel. Do they feel male? Do they feel female? Do they feel non-binary, genderqueer, or a non-Western gender? Their attraction, that's who they're attracted to. So their sexual orientation, that could be gay, it could be straight, it could be bisexual or pansexual, asexual. Your expression, your gender expression is different from your gender identity. So your gender expression is how you express that gender. So that's culturally influenced. So think about your gender expression. It could be masculine, it could be feminine, you could consider it neither. But think about skirts. In the United States, skirts are considered feminine gender expression. And in Scotland, men wear kilts all the time. It's considered very masculine. They wear kilts to their wedding. It's proper formal attire. And that's an example of gender expression where it varies from culture to culture. Or you think of men in Puerto Rico who have very, very long hair. That's macho over there. And here it's considered more feminine. And so what we're going to talk about today is someone's biological sex. And that's not related to these things. It can be, but it's not necessarily. Okay. And so biological sex is a mixture of primary and secondary sexual characteristics. So primary, that's what happens when you reproduce or during reproduction. And secondary, that's what happens during puberty. So those are features that appear later on in your life. And so primary, some examples are the number and type of chromosomes you have. You have XX, XY, XXY, XO, and XO and XYO. Those are something called mosaicism. So that's when some of your cells have X chromosomes, and some of them may have X and Y chromosomes, and some of them may not. and some of them may have just one X, and some may have two. It can be a mixture of different things. So another is the type of gonads, so your ovaries or testes or ovotestes, which is something in between, an intermediate state. The sex hormones, so testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, all those. We have some examples of hormones up here, some very vintage ones from the 1940s, and you might want to check them out after the presentation. So your internal reproductive anatomy, so if you have a uterus, do you have a cervix, do you have a vas deferens, do you have an epididymis? And the external genitalia, so that's a phallus, a clitoris, a vagina, urethra, and your perineum. And secondary sexual characteristics, they appear during puberty, so think your body and facial hair, your breast tissue, your vocal cords, how big they get, and fat distribution, whether it's on your stomach or your thighs. So this presentation is mainly going to focus on these 6 theories about biological sex in humans. And these are frameworks that people have created to try to explain and describe biological sex in a scientific way. So it starts in 1896. We've got 100 years of theories and arguments about what is biological sex. 1896, we have something called the Age of Gonads. They believed in 5 sexes. In 1899, we have Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a very famous German doctor, and he believed that your biological sex was a spectrum from male and female, and that there was an infinite number of variety in between. The age of surgery in the 2-sex system, that's the binary sex system that many of us are familiar with right now. And that was started in 1915. And then we have 1966, where we have psychosexual neutrality, and that was made up by John Money. And that has been disproven based on research. It's very wrong, but we'll talk about it still because it was very influential in modern topics of sex and gender. And then we get to Judith Butler in 1990, and she disputes whether biological sex is even a scientific framework in the first place. Like, does it make sense as a system, or is it totally inadequate for describing human sexual variation? And then we have a specific sex system, which may happen in the future, which is the Human Genome Project allows us to look at sex not just as chromosomes and genes and genitals, but as individual proteins and receptors on our cells that can influence our sex and our development and our gender identity and things related to sex. So with the 5-sex system, that was started by 2 British doctors named Sir George F. Blacker and T.W.P. Lawrence. And they said there's way too much dispute about what is a hermaphrodite, who's a hermaphrodite and who's not. And so they came up with 5 sexes, and they published an article, and they said, because there is so much disagreement, we're saying that your sex is determined purely by your gonads. So that's the presence of ovarian or testicular tissue in your body. And so they said, you can't tell from the outside, you have to use a microscope to tell. So here we have an example of what testes look like under a microscope. Here we have ovotestes, and here we have ovaries. And here are the ovarian follicles, and you can see those in the ovotestes. It's these round, blobby things. And in the testes, we have ductules in here, the seminiferous ductules, and those are over here in the ovotestes. They're not as well developed, but they're still there. And so that's what doctors were looking for in the 1800s when they were trying to determine someone's biological sex. And so here's an explanation of the 5 sexes. We have male, male pseudohermaphrodite, true hermaphrodite, female pseudohermaphrodite, and female. So male has testes and sexual characteristics associated with men. Male pseudohermaphrodites, they have testes, they could be internal, and they may not know they have them, but they could have secondary sexual characteristics associated with another sex. So it could be someone who has testes and breasts, someone who is assigned female at birth, has a vagina but has testes. A true hermaphrodite was someone who has both ovaries and both testes, or they have a combination ovotestes. And female pseudohermaphrodites have ovaries but secondary sexual characteristics associated with another sex, so think someone who has ovaries but may have a lot of facial hair, or may not grow breasts, or may have a phallus. And female has ovaries and secondary sexual characteristics associated with women. And so let's talk about what is hermaphrodism. So the word hermaphrodite, it's not politically correct. We shouldn't be using it to describe people. So from here on, I'm going to use the word intersex instead. So hermaphrodite in science means that a species, it can either self-fertilize or at some point during its life, it develops the ability to have like both ovaries and both testes. Not necessarily at the same time like the clownfish, which may start with testes and then change the ovaries later on in lifetime, but at some point they do have both fully developed and functional. And so this is an example of giant andromorphism, and that's an interesting intersex condition. It's very beautiful. See, you have one side that is developing as male and one side that's developing as female, and that's due to the mosaicism, which I mentioned earlier. And so here is andromorphism. And mosaicism says that you have a cell, and it splits, but it doesn't split evenly. So some of the cells get some of the chromosomes, some of them don't. And with these butterflies, you see this side has developed in a female manner, and this one has developed in a male manner, or associated with another sex. And that's not commonly found in people, but here we have an example from a book I have up front from our historical medical library at the Mutter Museum, where a man, he went to the doctor and he said, I only have one testicle, and it's giving me trouble, I'm feeling a lot of pain. And so they went in and they took everything out, and they found that he had a uterus, an ovary on one side, on the right side right here, and then on the other side he had a testy. And that's a man from over 100 years ago. And he identified as male, and the doctors, he didn't have a urethra at the tip of his penis. It was down here near his scrotum, near his testicle. And so what they did is they went in and they created a urethra right here at the end of his penis, and that was fine. And he could pee through his penis then. And they took out the ovary, the uterus, and that tube thing, which is not just explained at all. And he went on and had a happy life, had a happy marriage. Yep. We're going to save questions to the end. Is it pertinent? Okay. Yeah. And so then we're going to get to our next sexual theory, and that is the sexual spectrum and the Institute for Sexual Research. And that was created by Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld. He lived in Berlin in Germany, and in 1889 he published something called the Yearbook for Intersexual Variants, and he edited that for a very long time until 1923. And he published over 200 books and articles and pamphlets about gender, sex, and sexual orientation. And what he did is he said that being gay is not a moral flaw, it's not a spiritual illness, being gay is biological. And because it's biological, we must be able to measure it in some way. So we can tell who's gay, and we're going to prove that they are in an in-between state between male and female by measuring their pelvis size. So he published a lot of research on that. But in 1923, his research became very unpopular because there was a big public trial. There was a serial killer. He was a cannibal, and he was gay. And he went on trial for killing 147 people. So after that, the public stopped liking Dr. Hirschfeld's research because they believed that being gay made you morally corrupt. It made you a serial killer, it made you cannibal. So that's when a lot of people stopped reading his stuff. And then in 1933, that was Nazi Germany, and they burned the Institute for Sexual Research to the ground, so much of his work is lost to time. Okay. And that brings us to our next system, which is the two-sex system, and that's 1915, and that was by Dr. William Blair Bell. And he was a very famous surgeon. He was very well respected. He did not believe in the five-sex theory. He thought, wow, that's way too many. It's impossible. It's impractical. There was a saying that the only true hermaphrodite is a dead hermaphrodite because in order to prove hermaphroditism, according to that theory, you had to take out someone's ovaries or their testes and look at them under a microscope. Surgery is very dangerous, so people died when that happened. So oftentimes, if someone didn't want surgery to tell if they were a true hermaphrodite or not, it was only after they died that you could tell whether they were a true hermaphrodite, according to that theory. So he thought that was inhumane. He didn't like it, and he said, well, your gonads, your ovaries, your testes, your ovotestes, those are irrelevant. Those don't matter. And your biological sex should be determined by other things that are more prominent and more relevant to someone's everyday life. So the presence of breast tissue or facial hair, things that will make people make people you interact with gender you as male or female when they see them on your body. And because of that, he pushed for surgery, and he is the guy who kind of got started with intersex surgeries, what I'll get into later. But he believed that if someone had an ambiguous appearance or an appearance that didn't look believable enough as male or female, then they should be surgically reassigned, and they shouldn't have a choice, and they should, the doctor was the more important determiner of someone's gender and how comfortable they were with their body than that person was. And that brings us to our next theory, which is found many. Naturally, this two-sex binary model, which emphasized biological male and biological female as real, true concepts that had no variation in between, led to John Money's theory. And so he didn't like the Victorian emphasis on nature. He believed that someone's biological sex was nurture, and someone's gender identity was nurture. He worked at Johns Hopkins, and he believed that at the age of 3, someone's gender identity gets set. And before the age of 3, if you surgically modify their genitals to look male or look female, according to his definition of what male and female was, then that person's gender could change. So there was a very famous study, a twin study. 2 twins were born. They were both assigned male at birth, and they were getting circumcised. One of the twins had a problem with his circumcision. They accidentally burned off his penis. So what they did, the doctor said, well, let's do a study. We will give him a vagina. We will tell the parents to raise him as a girl. He'll get a girl name. We'll pretend that he was never assigned male and he never had a male name or male identity. And he'll perfectly adapt to living as a female. He'll be a great little girl. And that didn't happen. So at the age of 14, the child was very depressed, and he changed his name to a male name. It was different from the name he was given at birth, because he didn't know that he was assigned male at birth. And he transitioned. So he started taking male hormones instead of female hormones. And the study was considered extremely unethical because there was no follow-up, and Dr. Money is believed to have fudged the results of his early studies. So one study said that, at the age of 6, the girl was perfectly happy living as a girl, but that wasn't the truth. She was extremely depressed and resentful. And another thing that points about how unethical this study is and how important gender and biology and sex are to talk about is that both twins in the study eventually killed themselves. And there's a book about them called As Nature Made Him. And John Money, his theory was very radical, and because his data that he kind of fudged supported his radical theory, it got instituted as practice in many, many hospitals, including Johns Hopkins. And so a lot of hospitals have policies that are influenced today that say you should surgically assign infants who have ambiguous genitalia. You should surgically assign them male or female and then raise them as that gender. And they don't get a lot of support. It doesn't emphasize the correct things, which is support for the parents in dealing with a child who is intersex. It doesn't emphasize support groups for intersex kids so they can work about feelings about their bodies, which may be different from others. And that brings us to the 1990s, Judith Butler and gender trouble. So she came out with a book. She was a philosopher at Berkeley, and she's like a dean or something now. And she founded this field of study known as queer theory or queer studies. And the book Gender Trouble looks at biological sex, not as something that is definite and permanent, but as something that changes depending on what culture you're in, what society you live in, what your parents named you, even something like that can influence how people perceive your biological sex. And give me one second. So Butler says that science is just a way of classifying observations that people see in the natural world. And the way Americans classify sex in 2017, that's different than in 1917, as we just saw. And therefore, society dictates what the sexual norm is and what deviates from that norm. In that sense, sex is not a fact of the human body, and it's highly changeable. Sex is not necessarily a fact of biology either. It's a way that society deems inappropriate and appropriate bodies. And the evidence we have that sex is social and not scientific is that our classification systems have many, many exceptions, as we've just seen, and therefore they organize facts about sex around the most common bodies and not necessarily the most scientifically accurate or precise way. And so Butler says that sex is not a coherent scientific category. And so Butler, it's kind of like saying gravity is a law of the universe, but sex is a human construct. Sex is not a law of the universe. Reproduction is a fact, but sex is a way that humans classify that, and it's not necessarily good science. And so Butler says that there's no such thing as biological male and biological female. And that brings us to 2003, and a theory we have that's competing with Judith Butler's theory now is the Human Genome Project, and what that means for the future of human medicine. So now we can look at people's chromosomes, we can look at their genes, we can look at their individual proteins, and we can figure out sex to an extremely specific and precise detail. And these studies show that biological sex is not dependent on the sex chromosomes. It's dependent on certain genes that can be found on those chromosomes, but not all of the genes, and not most of the genes involved in biological sex are located on the sex chromosomes. So the X and Y chromosome, yes, we need them to live, but they don't necessarily determine our biological sex. And so the Human Genome Project really opens up a lot of doors about what is biological sex and how can we measure it. And how we classify biological sex now is going to change a lot in the future, in the next few decades. So one modern definition of sex. This is what you will find in medical school textbooks right now. And that says there's 3 sexes that we can measure. There's chromosomal sex, there's gonadal sex, and there's phenotypical sex. So, and that says that our formation of our reproductive structures depends on lots of things, including the genes involved, epigenetic factors, interactions with other embryos in the uterus. So twins, their hormones can influence each other in the womb. And in that same way, the parent can influence, with the hormones, the baby's sex. And so your prenatal environment can influence your sex. There was one study that said that, like, if one twin is gay, there's a 50% chance that the other twin is gay. And that has been reproduced repeatedly. And that's thought to be because of interactions between embryos in the uterus, or interactions between the parent's hormones and the embryos. And so gonadal sex, what is that? So we start out at something called an indifferent stage. This is what we all have when we're developing in the womb. We have a generic gonad, and then that will differentiate into something with a uterus, a vagina, an ovary, and a fallopian tube, or it will differentiate into a testes and an epididymis and a phallus. And so these 2 round bumps right here, that's the generic gonad, and that can turn into this, or it can turn into this, or it can turn into the ovotestes that I showed you earlier. There's a lot of possible combinations that you can have. And so here are only some of the genes involved in these differentiations. So if you want testes, then you have to have all these. And if you want ovaries, then you have to have all these. And sometimes these genes can cancel each other out. So the DAX1 gene, if you get 2 copies of that on an X and a Y chromosome, or on both X chromosomes, then it can cancel out the action of creating testes, and then you get just ovaries. And so there's lots of exceptions to this. And it's very difficult to study because it's in utero. And that brings us to the second of this modern definition of sex, and that's the phenotypical sex. So that's how those genes express themselves. And that is, we start out with something called an undifferentiated genital tubercle, and that can turn into this or this. So here is the development of a penis, and we still have an opening right here, and that's where the vagina is over here, and that will close up and form the bottom of the penis. And these things over here are going to turn into testes and the scrotum, and these are going to turn into ovaries and the labia. And so that shows you how similar penises and vaginas are anatomically. And a lot of intersex conditions involve penises that have a urethra down here, or a vagina that has a phallus up here, because of how similar these start and how they start out as completely the same. And it's hormones that influence which way it goes. And then that brings us to number 3, chromosomal sex. And so here we got an X chromosome, here we've got a Y. And they started out as the same chromosome. And the Y chromosome is just a broken X. So this part broke off, these 2 little legs, and that leaves us with a Y. And the Y chromosome is not found in many animals, and neither is the X. And the X chromosome has over 2,000 genes, and if without it, we can't live. Everybody needs an X chromosome. But the Y chromosome, we can live without it. And so mutations along these, that can be very common because they originally started out as the same chromosome. And that's why we get so much variation when it comes to these things, because they can switch. So, Quincy, you want to go? I'm going to introduce Quincy again.
Okay, so this is a karyotype. It is showing your chromosomal makeup. So tell me, based on what you see here, how would you classify this individual in terms of chromosomal sex? So 2 X's here. How would you identify this individual? Male, because the X chromosome and then the Y chromosome here. Now, how would you identify this individual? Mm-hmm. So these are the sex chromosomes. What do you see? Two X's and a Y. So how would you classify that individual chromosomally? Anyone else? Anyone else? So I heard someone say intersex. This would be an example of Klinefelter syndrome, where they have 2 X chromosomes and 1 Y. I'm sorry? Well, do we know enough to say that? It could express itself in many different ways, and I think that's what Tosef was trying to say, that though chromosomally you see 2 X's and 1 Y, there could be all sorts of interactions, and it could express itself in different ways. So this person would probably be classified as intersex. So the prevalence of intersexuality is actually more than you might think. Individuals with Klinefelters occurs 1 in every 1,000 births. Individuals who are not born with both X or XY is 1 in every 1,666 births. So the total number of people whose bodies differ from standard male or female is 1 in every 100 births. So this happens a lot more common than we might anticipate. And as we mentioned in the beginning, sex determination is pretty complex. It's not as simple as we think. We might think in binary terms, male and female, but from this example, there's a lot of gene interaction that will determine a person's sex. So in this example, if there is more of these genes, it may tip the scale in this direction. If there are more of these genes, it may tip the scale in that direction. So again, it's not as simple as male and female. In this diagram, it shows how complex this interaction is that's happening for every human on this planet. Okay, so that's our presentation for tonight. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. One of the things that I think that's really critical about the work that we do is we're helping a lot of young people who are LGBTQI identified. The Alpha STEM internship started in March, and now we have about 10 interns, and I'd say about half of them identify as trans. So this is an issue that's really important for our program. The Gender and Sexuality Development Symposium that we've hosted annually, I think the first one had probably about 200 attendees. These are clinicians, these are researchers, teachers, nurses, community members, all very interested in this topic. And the presenters from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia do an amazing job at explaining from a clinical perspective as well as from a mental health perspective how they're able to help young trans-identified teens and adolescents in Philadelphia. So again, thank you for giving us this opportunity.
Question right here.
Yeah, so we'll take questions.
One thing you didn't address is the extra Y chromosome. And the reason I raised that question is this, that in the late 1960s, there was a famous criminal case in Chicago where an individual named Richard Speck murdered 5 or 6 nurses. And in testing afterwards, Speck was found to have an extra Y chromosome. And one of the theories that developed out of that was that having an extra Y chromosome increased the likelihood of criminality. Now, Speck subsequently in prison, originally got the death sentence and they changed the law. But in prison, he did use hormones and lived as a female in prison. But I understand that the science of the extra Y chromosome, as it related to the likelihood of greater chance of criminality, has proven not to be accurate. Do you know about that case about the extra Y chromosome?
This is the first time I'm hearing about that, but it's very, very interesting, and I'm definitely going to look it up more.
But it was a controversy that I know at the time, and it was a debate. I don't know. You heard this case? Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Polar Y chromosome?
Older Y? Polar Y. It's very interesting that when they met an intersex person, their first idea was that there must be something biologically that's causing him to be violent rather than anything else that could have caused someone to be a serial killer. They just kind of jump to what they see as different.
Well, they took the idea that he was a serial killer, therefore he had extra Y chromosome, therefore people with extra Y chromosomes are tends to be criminal.
Yeah.
Not good science.
Nope, not at all. Another question?
Not a question or a comment. That
Okay.
was actually based on, or interpreted from some research that had been done decades before with rodents, with rats.
Okay.
That had an extra Y chromosome and had a very high level of testosterone hormone.
Mm-hmm.
And he said the two were correlated, and high levels of testosterone hormone contributed to aggressive behavior.
Okay. So I have a book over here that's very good. It's called Testosterone Rex, and it's dispelling the myth that testosterone makes people violent or more aggressive. Now, if you have high levels of any hormone, that can cause you to act out because you're not supposed to have the high levels in your body, right, of any hormone. But testosterone specifically doesn't make people more aggressive. In this book, it's really good. It talks about all the early studies on testosterone and how they reached a scientific conclusion that it makes people aggressive, and how that conclusion could be very well faulty because these studies weren't well controlled. They kind of jumped to conclusions with a lot of things, so I encourage you to check it out. Question?
So that the 1 in every 1,666 who don't have the XX or
Okay.
the XY, so that's like that one that you showed with the XX and the extra Y, the intersex, is that what that's referring to?
Yeah, it could refer to that. It could refer to having 4 X chromosomes and 1 Y, or it could refer to having mosaicism, like I talked about before. So that's anything that's not XX and not XY, so not those two. Anything that's not them. And these are studying live births, by the way, not stillborn or not anything like that. These are live babies. Yep.
So, throughout most of the 20th century, the general public and obstetricians were sort of locked into this gender binary genitalia to make it clearly male or clearly female because you had to be one or the other, right?
Yep.
That was the thought back then. And I'm just wondering now, in the United States in particular, how much of that still goes on? Are there still obstetricians performing these so-called corrective surgical procedures on newborns? I imagine it's trending away from that, but I just sort of wonder, like, how quickly, how much, and what's going on with it socially.
So the doctors behind that, instead of calling it something like a clitorectomy, which is removal of the clitoris, they said, oh, we don't do those anymore. We do clitoral reductions. So they just changed the name and slightly changed the technique of these surgeries, and then they say, oh, we don't do that anymore. That's outdated. And it's still practiced in the US. It's not as common as before. Like places like CHOP don't do it, but other hospitals, smaller hospitals do. And a letter just came out that was published by the 15th, 16th, and 17th US Surgeon Generals, and they were condemning these surgeries because it still happens worldwide. And it's sad that the US Surgeon Generals, they don't say that while they're in office, but they say it after they leave.
I mean, it's really a form of genital mutilation.
It is.
Sanctioned by society's sort of force feeding of the gender binary.
Yeah, and there's this idea that these kids, if they're born with genitals that don't match perfectly our standards of male and female, that there's something wrong with them, that they're going to grow up and have psychological problems, that they're going to grow up and feel separate and alien from other kids. But giving kids surgeries, it's never just one surgery. It's 5 surgeries, it's 10 surgeries. These kids and their babies, they can't consent to it. So it's an ethical question of how much surgery would you do on an infant that doesn't need it? It's not going to die without the surgery. And if it has proper psychological support, so if it goes to the support groups that are offered by some hospitals or some groups like the intersex, the American Society for Intersex People, they offer lots of materials for education and social support for people who are intersex. And those show that the psychological outcomes for intersex kids who have this support network is fine. They do well. But they don't do well when they get surgery, and they don't do well when they don't get proper therapy. Yep, question?
With the gender changing, it seems to me that the parents would be involved. Obviously, they would have to have consent.
Mm-hmm.
So is there counseling or some kind of thing going on with the parents to take that away, to normalize it?
A good hospital will do that, but a bad one will not. Or a doctor, they'll say, your kid needs a surgery, and the parents go, okay. So they don't give the parents full information. So they consent to it, but they don't have all of the knowledge.
There's expectations by the parents,
Yeah,
and they're not saying, well, it's not a boy or a girl, it's
yeah. They're trying to force the parents to pick one. Yeah, and nowadays, a good hospital, what they do to try to prevent that is they'll test the baby to see what kind of intersex condition it has. And we have studies now over the past 30 years that can give us a good idea of the percent of those babies who grow up to identify as male or female or non-binary. So one condition which I have in that book over there, the 1937 book from the Historical Library, there's a woman with congenital adrenal hyperplasia. A lot of women with congenital hyperplasia, it's also called penis at 12 disease. So they are assigned female at birth, and when they turn 12, when they get to puberty, they start growing a phallus. And so a lot of them, they'll be forced to live as men after they grow a phallus, even if they identify as women. And the studies say that 70% of those women identify as lesbian. So that's a very interesting correlation that we can't explain right now, but we can guess, if someone has congenital adrenal hyperplasia, they're probably going to identify as a woman and not a man, even though they have a phallus. Yep.
I actually have a question for Dr. Bowman. It's an anthropology question. So in the U.S., we, by and large, many of us culturally adhere to this notion of a gender binary. But there are other places in the world where culturally another gender, at least a third gender, is accepted and
recognized. Yeah.
absorbed into the culture. Can you speak to that?
It's certainly true. There are many cultures that do that, particularly the ones that come to mind are in India. There is a whole class of individuals that are recognized as not one or the other. Also in Native American cultures, I believe there were multiple I think it was 5, I forget how many, different names for different people. Some who lived as one sex, some who lived as other, some who switched. I mean, it's definitely, I think this whole idea in this culture that there is just the binary is just not seen in many other cultures. It really isn't. So, yeah, I don't know of specific other examples, but I think you know of another one. Okay, go for it.
So the one in Southeast Asia that she was referring to, that was the Hijra, which Quincy mentioned briefly on the driver's license slide. And they just did an Indian census, and they found over 500,000 people legally identified them as X, as Hijra, on their IDs for the government in India. So there are millions of people in this world who identify as non-binary, and they're recognized as non-binary legally, socially, in their cultures. And a lot of this emphasis on the gender binary was brought over by British colonization. It's something that British people kind of forced. It's like, if you look at anthropological texts talking about Native Americans in 1700s, 1600s, 1800s, they describe all these non-binary genders, but they don't have the words for it because in British culture, that's not what they had. So they describe it as a third gender, or they just say they were gay or something like that. And they are shocked that Native American cultures were so accepting of these people and not like trying to kill them like British people were. And in Judaism, if you look at the ancient texts, we have 5 distinct sexes that are described, and those sexes can, you can say their genders as well. And so it's something that history tries to erase. So when you read the Jewish texts now, you don't see mention to these because they get translated differently. Yep.
Just to go back for a moment when we go back to surgery, are there any statistics now about adults, intersex, or identifying as transgender or transitioning, who now elect to have surgery?
Mm-hmm.
Is it on the rise or the decline?
What do you mean?
Well, I think as identifying as intersex or transgender has become more socially acceptable, is there more of a pressure for people to have elective surgery, or now that it is acceptable to have it, is it more acceptable than to just transition sort of outwardly, as it were, or do they feel more of a need now to do the actual reassignment surgery?
So trans people, the number in the population has exploded in the past couple years, and that's because people have more knowledge about trans people because of the internet, things like YouTube, and same with intersex. A lot of people are starting to realize my genitals look like this picture that I saw on the internet, and that person's intersex. Am I intersex? Because we don't see that many people's genitals in their lifetime. Most of us don't. And so we don't know what other people have under their pants. So we don't know if what we have looks unusual or not, because we just don't have access to that knowledge, and nowadays we do. So that's part of the reason why that number has exploded and grown. The other reason is there's this idea that in the past, to be trans, you had to get surgery and things like that. That's not true. Non-binary trans people have existed for as long as trans people have existed. And surgery is an option now for people. It's a safe option that people can get. And in the past, it wasn't necessarily safe. In 1929, they started synthesizing synthetic testosterone, and that is what let trans people access transition medically. And so I'm sure the numbers grew a lot then in 1929, just as they grow today, where surgery techniques are more safe and people have more access to them. As for pressure to get surgery, well, there's always pressure for trans people to get surgery. I can't say whether it's more or less, but I know that the pressure is from the outside world telling people that, their bodies are supposed to look a certain way. It goes back to the binary sex model. I won't go all the way back to it. It's buried in there. But think of in 1916 when Dr. Blair Bell came out with the binary sex model, and he said we have to surgically assign people who don't look how we want them to look. That's very much the same thing that's going on today. And now the standards of healthcare for trans people and intersex people has changed, and they're very broad. So their standards are called the WPATH guidelines, and if you look them up, they don't say that any one trans person has to get surgery. So the current medical standards say no, trans people don't need surgery, and intersex people, they don't need surgery. Yep. Question?
Is intersex, is intersex or U or X an option on birth certificates now? Or no? I mean, I know you have it up the PA because a few years ago.
It might be in Utah, but I'm not sure. No, it might be in Oregon. I don't know about any other states, because Oregon has the most progress in that area in the United States. I think it is in Australia, too. In Australia, the reason they added an X gender designation is because there was someone who transitioned and changed their sex legally, and then they detransitioned. So they said, okay, this wasn't right for me. And so they went back to living as their assigned sex. And then they're like, wait, no, this isn't right for me either. So they transitioned again, and they needed more surgery to put back what was taken off. And so at that point, the Australian government was like, we want to cover this, but we don't know how. So they added another gender marker to the ID, so that way that person could get surgery. It went to the Supreme Court and everything in Australia.
3 times?
3 times, yeah, I think so.